All right, everybody, take a seat or get up from your seat or get into whatever position you like to be in for listening to podcasts, because I've got one for you right now. My name is David Parsons. This is Nostalgia Trap. Very happy to be with you. I hope you enjoy the conversation we've got for you today. Me and Danny Bessner wanted to bring back Jon Wiener onto the program. Jon is someone who was on a few episodes ago. We talked to him about his incredible book that he wrote with Mike Davis called Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. I think I've raved about that book and mentioned it on a number of different episodes because it connects so thoroughly with a lot of the stuff we do on Nostalgia Trap, particularly the idea of anti-capitalism in the 60s and 70s and how that stuff flows into and shows us something important about 2020. But we wanted to bring Jon back because of this Netflix film that he's associated with. This Netflix film is called Trial of the Chicago 7. I'm sure you've heard of it. As I mentioned in this conversation, tons of people I know, including people who listen to Nostalgia Trap and the people that are in my classes, have been asking me what I think of this movie. I hadn't seen it yet, but I finally sat down and watched it. I explain a little bit of my skepticism here because I'm kind of deeply invested in this history. The Chicago 7 trial. And by that I mean, I'm looking up right now at my Youth International Party manifesto poster, which has a big pot leaf in the center of it and describes in very radical language what's wrong with America. I'm drawn to the sort of 60s counterculture, particularly in its language, particularly in the challenge that it sort of set out to American culture and American culture's connection to the sort of evil and sadism of the Vietnam War. That's my jam. These guys are flawed heroes in some ways, but I was interested in this movie, but also cringing because of who made it. This movie is made by Aaron Sorkin, who is to me, sort of a villain in the story of the way we depict American politics and history on film and in TV. The Aaron Sorkin we could do a whole episode about because of his influence has been tremendous, right? I mean, we still talk about West Wing and Social Network and a million other bits of pop culture that he's been involved in. But Sorkin is now, entering into territory that sort of feels very personal to me, at least, because of my own sort of connection to it historically and politically, and what I research and write about. But Jon Wiener has a different connection to it because, he was around during this era. He has a lot to say about it. But he also wrote a book. He put out a book in 2006 called Conspiracy in the Streets: The Extraordinary Trial of the Chicago 7, which is sort of an annotated, abridged version of the trial transcript. And if you don't know this trial, it's famous for a number of reasons. But anyway, I was really scared to watch this Aaron Sorkin version of it. I was really happy to have this conversation with Jon and Danny Bessner so that we could sort of get into some of the generational tensions about the way we think about the 60s. Danny certainly had a lot to say about sort of the limits of this the 1960s radicalism and the Chicago 7 themselves. But I thought we had a really, really fun and I think productive conversation about Sorkin and about the way we remember the 60s. So I hope you enjoy this, and thank you, Jon Wiener, for coming back on the show and talking to us very frankly about what it was like to sort of be connected to this very particular version of the trial of the Chicago 7. So we will get to that in a moment. Just wanted to make you aware that I'm doing lots of stuff on Nostalgia Trap lately. We are doing lots of stuff on Nostalgia Trap lately, especially on the Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap, that's where we are posting bonus episodes, and I've been going live on YouTube every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, really enjoying those solo live streams where I'm just kind of thinking a lot about sort of my own life, but my own life as connected to particular landmarks in pop culture. So it's a way for me to sort of think about biography and memoir. I know that if you listen to this show, you know that's sort of a preoccupation of mine is biography and memoir. So I'm sort of like going down the rabbit hole of my own memories in some way, but I don't want it to just be a sort of navel-gazing thing. I want to sort of connect it to the history that we're all a part of, which is this, sort of post fall of the Berlin Wall, 90s into the 21st century, that I think a lot of the sort of cultural moments that we've all been a part of can kind of provide a map. And anyway, that's what I've been doing live. If you can't catch me live, patrons of the show can listen to it. I post the audio and video up every Thursday. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much for the people that are supporting the show. It's really fun to hear everyone else's stories as I bring up where I was when I saw Lethal Weapon and things like that, and why those films, those 80s and 90s action films, sort of packed really difficult notions into my own sort of inner architecture, and I think that connecting with people on the Patreon about that sort of stuff has been very illuminating. So I appreciate all the people that are commenting on the episodes and all that. That's been really fun. We have lots more for you coming very soon. So thanks for all the support, and let's get to our conversation. This is me, Danny Bessner, and Jon Wiener talking about the trial of the Chicago 7. Well, we have Danny and I have watched Trial of the Chicago 7 on Netflix, the Aaron Sorkin film that I think came out about a month ago, and you know it's a film that covers something near and dear to my heart, which is 1960s radicalism and the different strands of radicalism that sort of come together in that trial. So, Jon, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it. Nice to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. Just a big fan. Just wanted to say that. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Yep, we had Jon on about a month and a half ago, I think, and we talked about L.A. Set the Night on Fire, L.A. in the 60s, which is the book you wrote with Mike Davis. And this is a very different take on the 60s. This is sort of, I feel like the Set the Night on Fire is a book that very much covers a lot of stuff that we haven't heard in popular culture. We haven't seen a lot of radicals whose names we don't know, actions that we don't remember. But this film, Trial of the Chicago 7, and the book that you wrote, Jon, called Conspiracy in the Streets: The Extraordinary Trial of the Chicago 7, which is really a sort of annotated transcript or of the book, or an abridged transcript of the trial, I should say. But either way, how did you get started thinking about the Chicago 7? Because I know you've written about the 60s and written about this era before, and it's, you know, written about John Lennon. These are sort of the stars of the 60s in our minds, and you've written about them in ways that sort of reflect how complicated their legacy is. But what made you write this book in particular, Jon, on the trial?
Well, how do books come to be? This book was not my idea. This book was the idea of the publisher at the New Press, and he had already tried to put this book together. He had an intern working on editing the transcript down from the court transcript is more than 20,000 pages. And there's like one book has a 900-page abridgment. One book has like a 350-page abridgment, and he wanted like a 200-page abridgment. And he had an intern working on that named Adam Schatz, who today is a editor at the London Review of Books and a contributor to the New York Review of Books. So this just shows, you know, what happens when you go to work on the Chicago 7. This was like in the 2010 or something like that. And they'd gotten permission to use the courtroom drawings of the very famous old-time cartoonist Jules Feiffer, who was the cartoonist of the Village Voice in its golden days. And they'd gotten a very famous cover photo, a portrait of all the defendants on the first day of the trial, taken by Richard Avedon. That photo is now in the Museum of Modern Art, and you know he's a famous portrait photographer. So they had sort of this package that they were trying to launch as a book, and they asked me to take over, to write an introduction. So I wrote like a 40-page introduction to the case, just kind of explaining what this was about, what the events were, what the trial strategies were, how to understand the charges, how to understand the jury, how to understand the larger historical context. And then I did a lot of work on this transcript of getting it to be readable. I don't know if you've ever tried to read a court transcript, but they're pretty impossible. So we edited to make it into a readable thing. Tom Hayden joined me on this and wrote the afterword, sort of fitting it into the history of his life and what happened afterwards, going up through other big demonstrations after Chicago 68. And then New Press published it in 2010 or something like that, because their idea was that there was a movie coming out at that point, and they thought they could piggyback on the movie. But that movie got canceled. Then the book came out, and it had its life, and the life was over. And then we read that Steven Spielberg was going to produce a movie written and directed by Aaron Sorkin and starring Sacha Baron Cohen as Abby. So then New Press planned to reissue the book, because now there was a movie. It was going to be a big movie. Then that movie was finished but postponed because of COVID, and then MGM gave up on it and just sort of threw in the towel and sold it to Netflix, because now everybody was going to be at home. And of course, it turns out many more people see a movie on Netflix during the COVID pandemic than would ever go to the movie theaters to see it. So it's a much more successful movie than it would have been. Aaron Sorkin says, I'm the luckiest guy in the world because we've been planning this for like 10 years. And then the book is out. So we're all happy.
Yeah, it's pretty lucky, and I was so excited to hear that you wanted to talk to us, and because I have so many questions, but before we even get into that, and questions about the movie and questions of interpretation, I think one thing that'll hang over this conversation is that our interpretations of the movie will really depend on what we think of the legacy of the 60s, and looking from the perspective of 2020 and what happened to a lot of the Chicago 7 and the New Left generally, broadly speaking, capaciously defined. I'm just curious, as someone who was there, who lived through it, who's now written about it, for years and years, from the perspective of 2020, what's your take on the legacy of the New Left, given what's happened the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years?
Well, that's kind of a big question. The legacy of the 60s, for a long time, I've been saying, will we ever get over the 60s? For people who are the age of you guys, you're historians. So this is kind of a professional, this is your job to ask what is the legacy of the 60s. But for, Black Lives Matter or climate activists today, I'm not sure this is the legacy of the 60s is all that important. What's happening now is, especially with Black Lives Matter.
That says something, though, right? If the legacy of the 60s isn't that important, that's a big thing. That's a big statement.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I'm not doing my duty here as a historian, but the 60s movements we can now see were very male dominated. Like, you try to get a woman who was part of the trial of the Chicago 7, there weren't any women in the leadership of those demonstrations. Today, Black Lives Matter is an organization founded by Black women and still led by Black women. And I must say, they're pretty darn good at it. They've had millions of people in the streets, where Chicago, there were 15,000 people or something like that. Really not very many, even though they got on TV. The 60s combined this kind of cultural radicalism that in the movie is represented correctly by Abby Hoffman, played by Sacha Baron Cohen. And they had sort of a total critique of capitalist life. They were for play, not work. They were for consciousness raising, not sobriety. They were, etc. We could go on.
Could I just interrupt you right there? Because
Sure.
that's sort of the for people that haven't read your book, that's sort of the thrust of your introduction is sort of showing that the trial sort of combined these three and sort of why the
Yes.
government was going after them. These like
Yes.
three different elements of the 60s, whatever the 60s were the 60s left, I guess you would call it, which are the cultural radicals, the yippies, the sort of people who are like, let's sort of live differently. I have the Yippie International Party manifesto looming above me as I'm looking. You know, and it says something like the opening just says, America is a death machine run on and for money, whose power determines a society based on war, racism, sexism, and the destruction of the planet. It's a really radical statement. And one thing I would say is I don't hear that in the movie. I didn't hear that level of radicalism out of Abby Hoffman's mouth. It was, I wanted more of that in the movie. But the other part of it was that you've got cultural radicals. That's one element. The political radicals, who are like the Dave Dellingers, the Tom Haydens, the Rennie Davis, sort of like the straight politicos, the SDS.
Mass street protests.
Right.
The streets belong to the people. A very traditional kind of left-wing activism, but they were able to mobilize hundreds of thousands and eventually 500,000 people, whereas it's hard to tell whether the yippies really mobilized anybody.
Right.
And then maybe just to be a little cynical about that, I think it's also, we could also take whether that mobilization really mattered. And to what degree, you know, because I'm personally pretty cynical about, I mean, put my cards on the table, I'm pretty cynical about all of these people for the most part, and their legacy in particular, and what it has to say to the let's say the next left coming today, and particularly as they're filtered through Aaron Sorkin's imagination as well. But we could talk about that maybe in a little bit. Sorry,
happy to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder that, and I part of me watching the film last night, I was like, putting it on it. You know, you say like, I had several students in my classes. I teach these classes that are lifelong learning classes that are all the students are in their 60s and 70s. They were desperate to know what I thought of Trial of Chicago 7. And I put off, and I know some of them will be listening to this episode because I told them that we would have you on, Jon, and we would talk about it. And I think part of my sort of reluctance to watch it was knowing that it was an Aaron Sorkin film, knowing that I was sort of feeling like I was deeply invested. I think more than Danny, these characters, many of them were sort of heroes to me especially when I was younger, and as I get older, I see them as a little bit more complicated. But either way, I was sort of scared to watch this movie. I thought, I'm wondering how they're going to depict these people, how they're going to depict this stuff, and that's part of why I think it took me a while to watch it. And watching it last night, you know, it's sort of like I think it's hard to watch as a historian of the 60s, any sort of depiction of the era, because you're necessarily making like incredible shortcuts and editing. But I'm wondering, in terms of editing and things like that, maybe we can start with that. What this book you mentioned you had to cut down from 20,000 pages. What were the how did you do that in terms of like what were the parts that you really felt were most important? Because it feels like you're cutting out 90% of what happened. How did you kind of draw out what was important about this trial?
Well, we wanted the clearest statement by each side of sort of the essence of their case. A lot of the prosecution case is extremely boring testimony from undercover agents about, you know, Tom Hayden gave a speech, the whole speech, what did he mean? Whereas the defense case, which also went on for like a month in the courtroom, they wanted to present the counterculture in all its glory, to show that that what happened, especially in Grant Park, where the police beat people quite aggressively, let us say, was not a crime. It was a cultural festival. So they had, you know, and all of these people are, we included a little bit of each of them in the book. Let me just run down. I mean, they're famously Allen Ginsberg, Phil Oakes, Timothy Leary, Arlo Guthrie, Judy Collins singing, you know, the counterculture in its glory. So we had to have a little bit of each of them. We had to have the closing two of the defendants were chosen to make closing statements, Rennie Davis and Abby Hoffman. So those had to go in there. And of course, the judge, the outrageous, unbelievable criminal conduct of the judge had to be in there. And the the delightful stunts of the yippies, and then the heart of the trial, by far the biggest thing, the only really gigantic historical thing that happened in this trial was that Bobby Seale was bound and gagged in the court in an American courtroom, a black man in chains for 4 days. Everything else dwarfs in comparison to that. So we had to put that in the book, and then you're up to 200 pages and you're done.
I guess I'm wondering what's the differences between the book and the movie, because as I'm reading your book, as I'm reading your book, I get a much deeper sense, and I didn't even finish the three. It's cultural radicals, political radicals, and black radicals, who are the ones that are targeted by the Nixon administration, right? And are the ones that they are targeting using marijuana. They're going to use cocaine. They're going to use drug policy to go after these guys. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff involved with COINTELPRO and that sort of stuff, but I wonder what your thoughts on that, because as I was watching the movie, I thought it was a very different version, and even in the sort of the tone of the radicalism that you get from the radicals themselves is different than your book, John. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Daniel, you were about to inject something. I feel might have been.
I just want to build up on that very briefly, because as David and I were talking, it seems like the movie essentially says there's good radicalism of the Tom Hayden SDS variety, and there's bad, foolish radicalism. Not only foolish, but immature of the Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman variety, which is, of course, represented in the fact that Jerry Rubin becomes a stockbroker at the end. So I was just wondering, as you answer David's question, if you could also maybe comment on what you thought of Sorkin's interpretation of sort of like very, very clearly and almost sort of hitting you over the head with what he considered to be good, acceptable radicalism and what he considered to be ridiculous, naive radicalism. And we'll talk about this a bit later. I think that also has to do with Sorkin's take on Judaism and Jewishness, which I think is sort of a subcurrent to the movie that I want to get your take on.
Yeah, I'd love to
very
talk about
much
that.
so.
Love to talk about that too. Well, first of all, preliminary observation. This is not a documentary. This is a fiction film. The goal of Aaron Sorkin is to entertain and to get millions of people to watch this and tell their friends that was a really good movie, you should watch it. And he has succeeded. There's something like 260 reviews of this on Rotten Tomatoes. They're 90% positive.
Yeah.
Everybody loves this movie. So that should be our starting point. Number one, it is not a documentary.
Is that good or bad, though?
And number two, it's an extremely successful Aaron Sorkin production. And I have to say, speaking as a historian, one of the most boring things a historian can say about a movie about the past is it's not accurate. But since accuracy was never Sorkin's goal, that's in some ways it's kind of irrelevant to what he thinks. Nevertheless, you guys are kind of the average Americans. Everybody wants to know, did that really happen? Did that guy really do that? Was the black man really bound and gagged in an American courtroom before the world? Was Jerry Rubin that stupid? Was Abby Hoffman that funny? They want to know because it's a real event. The movie uses the names of real people, and we feel that you have certain obligations when you use the names of real people about what they really did with their real lives. So this makes it complicated because Aaron Sorkin is trying to make an entertaining movie, and we have other criteria, let us say.
Yeah. And I feel that throughout the whole thing. I mean, and that's part of, I think, what the sort of skepticism or reluctance to watch the film was sort of feeling, well, this maybe isn't for me. This movie is not aimed at people who are already engaged in literally, I mean, thinking about the politics of these guys. And they are all dudes, and that's part of it. I think that, you talk about, in your book, John, you cast the trial as a sort of place that sort of summed up in a lot of ways a lot of the big conflicts within the left during the era. And maybe the fact that there aren't women on trial is maybe representative of that, and shows that. But either way, I felt like the expecting the politics and expecting it to be exactly as it was. That's a very different sort of thing. But what I mean by that is like your book is serving as a different function than the movie. But I think that the movie that's part of why I was so troubled by it. Because the movie chose very specific sort of ways to portray the sort of politics of these guys. And I wonder, I mean, I'll just choose one line that a lot of people have pointed out. I wonder what you think of it. Because I don't know if Abby actually said this. Did Abby actually say, like, Abby Hoffman actually say, like, I believe in, the institutions of this country, and they're like, they're beautiful democratic institutions, but they're just run by terrible people right now? Did he say that? Because that feels like a very, like, kind of Sorkin, aiming at Trump sort of line. I'm not sure if that's actually something that reflects Abby Hoffman's politics.
Yeah, I'm not aware that Abby said that. The one thing that Abby said, Abby said many amazing and wonderful things. In his closing statement at sentencing, he said, he said to the prosecutors, "You say I'm un-American." He said, "Actually, I feel very American." He said, and I thought that was a great thing. And he actually did say that. And you can see what he means.
The flag shirt, I guess. It makes sense.
Well,
yeah.
Not only that, I'm part of, I grew up in American culture, and, I'm an American guy, and the things I don't like are part of being an American. In a way, because Sacha Baron Cohen relishes this role so much, loves this role so much, and puts so much into it, Abby Hoffman is kind of the star of the movie. I mean, everybody else sort of pales next to him, but aside from the Bobby Seale section starring Yahya Abdul-Mateen, which is shown with a lot of intensity and passion and respect. But Abby gets a lot of great lines and is a fun guy, but the arc of Abby Hoffman's character, screenwriters out there know about arcs, is, he's the clown who learns to be serious, because he jokes about this thing that he said, if you give me he told the city officials, if you give me $100,000, I'll just go home and forget about the whole thing. And they press him on this at a press conference. And he said, well, I was kidding. That was a joke. And they said, well, what is your price? 200,000, $500,000? What would it take to get you? And he said, my price. This is really, he really said this. My price for the revolution, my life.
It's in the film. Yeah, that part.
That is in the film. Okay. So, the arc of the film is the clown learns to be serious.
Yeah, but that's problematic in my perspective. Sure. Very problematic in my perspective, because this comes back to what I think is my major criticism of the movie, which from my perspective, I don't care about veracity. I completely understand that it's a fictionalized perspective, but Sorkin is so doing what Sorkin always does. He's like very much an establishment liberal, and he's essentially saying that to be, he essentially fetishizes seriousness. I might add the seriousness that not only got us the Vietnam War, but the seriousness that got us the post 9/11 security state, the intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Great Recession of 2008, and many more things. So to me, he actually denuded the story of the trial. He denuded the potentially radicalizing perspectives of it by having that exact character arc, and then again having Hayden, I think, really be the hero of the story. Yeah. I think Hayden is mostly presented as like, this is the guy who has the right thing. So I actually I found that a little, I mean, just to be frank, distasteful on Sorkin's part, because if anything, 2020 is not a time for establishmentarian politics. Not only was Donald Trump just elected, but we very well be facing a genuine climate catastrophe, and Sorkin's response is to promote electoralism and quote unquote seriousness. Great. And I think that was very problematic.
Thank you, Danny.
Point.
Yeah.
Can I talk about the happy ending?
Yeah.
Of course, the trial
Please.
Did not have a happy ending. The trial ends with guilty verdicts, 5-year sentences against the central 5 people, in addition to 4-year sentences to several of them for contempt of court. Again, Abby has a wonderful line that the sentence is 5 years and a $5,000 fine. And Abby says, $5,000, Judge, can you make it $350? So even at the end, he's in character. But that's the real ending. The real ending of the trial is they failed to convince even one juror that they were not guilty of the incitement to riot charge. And that's not a happy ending. But Sorkin said, Sorkin was on Fresh Air a couple of weeks ago. I wrote down what he said. He said, I like movies that end with a lump in my throat, that give me a goosebump experience and make me feel 2 inches taller when I leave the theater.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what he's trying to do here. And that's the Tom Hayden ending. The character called Tom Hayden, let's put him in quotation marks.
Right.
Daniel is absolutely right. He gives this speech to Abby about how if you can't win elections, you're nothing, and
it's ridiculous. It's crazy.
and then the judge tells him, and when it comes time for sentencing, Mr. Hayden, you could go far in this system.
Yep.
But you have to act right. You have to give a closing statement that is remorseful and that is not political. And if you do that, the judge tells him, I will look favorably on you when it comes to sentencing. And this is actually true. And, the tension builds in the courtroom and with the audience. What will Tom do? Will Tom do the right thing?
Yeah.
And the judge says, do you understand, Mr. Hayden? And he says, yes, I understand. Remorseful and not political. And then Tom stands up and reads the list of names of the American dead, which we've learned throughout this movie is being compiled by Rennie Davis, bringing the war back. The judge has not allowed them to talk about the war. The judge says the war has nothing to do with this trial, but their view is the war is everything. The war is America. We're here to stop this war. He reads the list of names. The audience in the courtroom goes crazy with cheering. We at home, even I, could hardly resist standing up and cheering. Yay, Tom Hayden. Tom, here's the happy ending. Tom Hayden has learned to stand up to unjust authority. Tom Hayden has learned from this trial that elections aren't everything, that sometimes you have to speak truth to power. Sometimes you have to be political, even when you're told not to be political. So Tom Hayden learns to take a stand. That's the happy ending.
Did that really happen? Did it happen that way?
No. Absolutely.
And I would also say that was unearned in the movie. It kind of happens on a dime and for no reason. But it's like Tom Hayden says something for 95% of the movie, and then like he feels bad because an African American maid semi-chastised him. It was so Sorkin. It was so Sorkin.
Yes, this follows the Sorkin
liberal. The pathologies of modern American liberalism embodied in a person. I mean, Sorkin, I was saying the other day, he's like the Bertolt Brecht of our era. Like all the pathologies and contradictions of the era are represented in Aaron Sorkin's output.
I think Bertolt Brecht was a little better, but
way better.
Let me say one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me say one more thing about the ending.
Yeah.
This is a ridiculous thing to say about Tom Hayden, even in the context of the movie. Tom Hayden has been charged with 2 felonies by the United States government the government says that he's been urging thousands of young people to attack the police in the streets of Chicago. So even in the movie, Tom has learned to stand up, to injustice and to challenge the status quo. So, and of course, in real life, Tom Hayden was one of the founders of SDS, devoted his life to community organizing and to, the move from protest to resistance. And he'd given a fiery speech at the Days of Rage the previous month in Chicago. So it's a ridiculous thing to say about Tom Hayden. But in the context of this movie, let me just raise a question for you guys. To tell the, millions of American people sitting at home watching Netflix that speaking truth to power, standing up to injustice, challenging the status quo when it's wrong is a good thing and makes you a hero and the people will cheer you. That's not a bad message for a Netflix movie, don't you think?
I get it. I mean, for me, it's always Atticus Finch. Like, Sorkin's characters are always Atticus Finch.
Yeah.
And that works on people. I mean, if it has an effect on politics and, the larger culture is another question. I mean, I understand why he does it and why he wants to hit those notes. He doesn't want to give us, like, to me, I guess that's part of the trial of the Chicago 7. To me, is just an immensely troubling part of American history, and something that all of the sort of things that it reveals are still very much present. And like to end it with this sort of the reading of the names of the American troops that died, I mean, to me, it didn't even capture the level of radicalism that these guys talked about the Vietnamese. I mean, Hayden,
yeah, I was going to say exactly.
Yes. I mean,
exactly.
And Danny, I know that you're like, very cynical about these figures, these 60s radicals and things like that, and I'm maybe a little bit less so. But either way, I think we can all agree that their depiction in this film does not really capture. It's not really fair entirely to all of them. And Tom Hayden, as an example, he goes to Vietnam after this trial.
He went before
too, right?
He and Rennie went before and brought home POWs, and were
right. So there's that element of it, and I think that's part of what was troubling for me. But yeah, the troops being read at the end, that sort of like sweeping ending that's happening. It even has like Julius Hoffman, the judge, is striking his gavel like a Hollywood judge. You're in contempt, and it's all sort of like a happy moment. It leaves you with this feeling that the evil has been vanquished.
Exactly.
Order has been restored, and we move forward. But I'm like, Julius Hoffman, his attitude throughout this film is very much indicative of sort of like, and I don't know, maybe he was trying to do this, Sorkin, but it is indicative of the sort of like, hyper authoritative government figures from Trump to whoever that are still very much the poison within the American system. So I felt like there's the happy ending is, on the one hand, it's inspiring for people. On the other hand, it kind of gives you an idea that sort of action very quickly fixes things when it's much bigger.
Yeah, I think a good ending would have been just ending on Bobby Seale, confined in court, because that would reflect the reality of American power in some sense. I think that I would say that personally, from my perspective and where we are today, like facing true potential catastrophe, the message to be taken away is you cannot have a happy ending to this story, because the story is ultimately, the ending is not happy. A lot of these people went in directions that I find incredibly distasteful and counterproductive and anti-left wing on one hand, and then two, the American justice system is still horrible. Yeah, Abby, and then he killed himself. So what does that say? But the American justice system, I think, is awful. It's 2 justice systems, 3 justice systems where the wealthy are protected at the expense of everyone else, and that there's very little that has actually been cured. So I think like a genuine movie would have actually ended on a down ending, on an ending that would say that these people failed, and that actually should make us look inside, because I think Americans in particular, and Sorkin is again the embodiment of this, like to flatter themselves, particularly with their faith in the institutions. And I think that's why people were so aghast at Trump. Trump, in retrospect, didn't really do anything that much more horrible than Obama. I mean, you could quibble here and there. At least he didn't start any wars or intervene in Libya and send weapons. Well, he probably did send weapons to Syria, but at least he didn't intervene and destroy Libya. But like, people were aghast at Trump because, he showed that the institutions were just capable of having this monstrous personality. And I think people like Sorkin and Americans in general want to have faith in these decrepit, atavistic, and frankly oppressive institutions. So for that reason, is why I found that ending personally problematic.
Yeah, well, let's talk about there is a Sorkin method, which was very evident on The West Wing, which is, men, it's almost always men, give these uplifting Atticus Finch's speeches to each other. Women listen and appreciate. And through this process of debate, the men come to understand each other better, and they see that their opponents are not all bad, and that they themselves may have some flaws they were not aware of beforehand. So the ending of the typical West Wing show is that each side comes to appreciate the other is not quite as bad as they thought. And that's what happens. I mean, in this movie, it's the Tom Hayden Abby Hoffman struggle that is the most Sorkinized.
Yeah,
they are debating, but
also Schultz, who was a horrible guy as far as I'm concerned. He would even prosecute these people. Right.
They also have Schultz. Also, his character arc is: should he be a careerist and try to advance in the Nixon Justice Department, or should he do what he knows is right, which is that these people really didn't conspire, they didn't start a riot, So he has a conflict between what is right and his career, and that's another message of this movie. Actually, the person who really should be complaining about this is Richard Schultz, and he is complaining about it. Actually, he's still around. He's done a couple of events in Chicago.
What's he saying?
He says, this movie is full of lies about me. I never thought these people were innocent. I never told Nixon's Attorney General John Mitchell that they didn't conspire together. They were guilty. We were right to prosecute them, and the jury understood. And so
why is Sorkin so invested in making him, as portrayed by Joseph Gordon-Levitt? Why is Sorkin so invested in making him such?
This is my theory of Sorkin. He's a product of this rotten system, and he's succeeded very much within it. And so, subconsciously or not, all of his movies basically attempt to inspire trust in this totally corrupt system. And there's also related to his Jewishness, which, as a Jew, I find personally offensive.
Danny, you've got more of a tack on this than I do. But that was something that came up. Before I let you go on that, Danny. That's something that came up in your book, John. And
can I just say one more thing about Richard Schultz?
Sure.
So Richard Schultz. So Tom Hayden's son Troy says this is horribly unfair to his father. David Dellinger's daughters say this is horribly unfair to Dave because they have Dave Dellinger, lifelong pacifist, hitting somebody at the end of the movie, which never happened.
That's fucked up.
But Richard Schultz is also complaining. They gave me a conscience. I didn't think I didn't see a conflict between right and wrong here. So while the good guys take a stand, against war and injustice, the other message of the film is don't be like the prosecutors, don't do unjust things to advance your career. Again, it's a very Sorkin-ish thing to say, but it's not a bad thing to tell people watching TV.
Right.
I just wish people our age could have careers. It's like so not relevant, as you know from the academic job market. Yeah. John, like these are messages that are so atavistic.
You're right.
I cannot underline it. Like all of my peers don't even have fucking careers, and I don't need lectures from Aaron Sorkin about how to be the organization man.
For those that haven't seen the film, Joseph Gordon-Levitt at the end during this moment in which Hayden is patriotically reading the names of all the dead U.S. troops in Vietnam, and everyone's standing up for him reverently. Schultz's character stands up, and everyone else on the prosecutor team is like, "What the fuck are you doing? Why are you standing for the?" And he says, "Respect for the dead, sir." And I thought that's the most Sorkin thing I've ever heard. And to me, just that in terms of the Vietnam War historian, the beef with turning the Vietnam War into something that happened to American soldiers is something that really bothers me and feels like it's part of pop culture in a big way. Yeah. And I feel like Sorkin's not really intervening on any of that. He's sort of repeating that sort of idea.
Well, and the other problem with the Sorkinization approach to history is this thing about if we only understood each other a little better, if we only had public argument and debate and shared our views, we would learn to respect each other. There's one thing we've learned from Trump's America is that if those days ever existed, if there ever was a center in America where you could respect each other's differences and come to some kind of compromise solution, Trump completely ended that era. That's, I mean, so I agree with Daniel completely. Sorkinism is totally obsolete in our world.
Yeah.
Even before Trump, Mitch McConnell wouldn't see, Supreme Court milk toast Merrick Garland. This is something that precedes Trump. And I would say, in fact, sorry, I'm getting heated. The politics of Sorkin
How much coffee have you had, Danny?
A ton, are directly responsible for producing Trump, for producing recession, for producing American and global immiseration, and producing the world we live in today. So I actually would say it's actively evil. I would say that it's actively negative, the message of Sorkin and his movies.
That's why, and just to build on, that's why I hated that moment with Abby Hoffman saying that, I think that the system is good. It's got some bad people in control right now, because it to me, it's like, well, these guys were all against the Vietnam War, and they saw the Vietnam War, and Hoffman Abbey used symbols of Nazism and used symbols of Hitler to describe, Vietnam and how serious it was, and communicating, what a devastating and violent act it was. So to hear him say that was kind of like, well, wait a second, the bad people in charge. At this point it's the Nixon administration, but Sorkin even opens the movie with LBJ, the idea of Vietnam is a liberal project, and Danny, I think you put it well. That sort of seriousness produced the Vietnam War, and that part of it, right? And so that part of it is disturbing because it's the bad guys and good guys in charge doesn't really get us to really what caused the Vietnam War was that this sort of violent. Psychotic anti-communism that took over the federal government and caused actors like JFK, very liberal people who on paper supported civil rights movement, things like that, to dedicate the American military machine to slaughtering peasants in Vietnam. To me, that's a really important fact, and it's not something that comes out in the Sorkin movie at all. That's what these guys were talking about at the time too. I mean, Hoffman and Hayden. They had these conversations. I guess you just don't see them. You just don't see them in the film.
Yeah, and I would just say, what is Sorkin war on? Obama, so who's someone who's going to drone strike Afghani weddings and kill innocent people? I mean, is that the serious person that we want? I mean, I totally understand why something like this, why Sorkin is as successful as he does, because he flatters Hollywood liberals who have money. And so it's just so problematic that these are the messages being broadcast to millions of people in the exact historical moment when if we don't make serious institutional and political changes to things, we're going to see literally hundreds of millions of people's lives immiserated, lost, and deracinated. And
there's one other element of the movie where Sorkin makes this case, which we are now criticizing, and that's the part about Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General for LBJ.
Yes.
Now, this is actually true, but
very important.
It gets left out of a lot of the story, but it's emphasized in the movie. You have to remember, these demonstrations were aimed at the Democrats. It was the Democratic National Convention because the Democrats were the war makers. The Yippie Festival of Life posed itself as an alternative to what they called the Festival of Death, the Democratic Party convention.
Right.
So these guys were radical. They were not looking for some middle ground where we could all compromise. The movie, though, kind of doesn't mention the Festival of Death aspect of the Democratic Party that much and makes a big deal out of the fact, which is a true fact, that Ramsey Clark, the Democratic Attorney General of the outgoing administration, had decided not to prosecute any of the Chicago demonstrator leaders for federal crimes. His view was if they committed crimes, this is up to the local authorities in Chicago and Illinois, which is true. I mean, nobody else has ever been prosecuted under this federal anti-riot law. It's kind of amazing that Trump had never thought of this before. But anyway, they make a big deal.
He's kind of an idiot, it turns out.
Well, it is. Yeah. I mean, I wrote a piece for The Nation that headlined "Why I Hope Trump Doesn't Watch Aaron Sorkin's movie," because it might occur to him. He might say to Bob Barr, we should do this. We could indict the leaders of Black Lives Matter under the federal anti-riot law and put them all on trial and tie them up for years. He hasn't thought of that. But the movie, Aaron Sorkin makes a big deal of the fact that the Democratic Attorney General is willing to testify for the defense, showing that the Democrats really are the good guys here because they would never have had this trial, which actually is true. If Humphrey had been elected in November of 1968, all the evidence is they would not have indicted the leaders of the Chicago protests. This was a Nixon project, but you can make a big deal of that, or you can make not very much of that. And Aaron Sorkin, it's very important to his worldview that the Democrats were good when it came to the central event of his movie, the prosecution of these radicals.
So, David, can we talk about the Jews? Because I haven't heard anyone talk about this, and I think it's so important to this movie.
I think that just to follow up on what John said, just really quickly, I think it's a really important thing to point that out, that this was that these radicals were attacking the Democratic Party, but also that Ramsey Clark is, first of all, he's a lot younger. A lot of the actors are a lot older in this film. Michael Keaton is 66 years old. Ramsey Clark was in his early 40s, I think. When
he was 42, yeah.
But yeah, Ramsey Clark is a guy that is sort of like he's a figure that I remember right after 9/11. He was around on the left. So in other words, he had a sort of like post government career in which he was sort of making speeches on the left about American foreign policy and stuff like that. But Sorkin wants to put him up there as a hero. But as you write in your book, even John, I mean, Ramsey Clark as Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson was not shy about prosecuting radicals. So there's plenty of people who were sort of had their left activities interrupted by Ramsey Clark's Justice Department. So go ahead, Danny. I know we want to talk about the Jewish question. It's something that I think is an important element of the trial that doesn't really come out as much in the movie as it does in the book and the other stuff I've read about the trial.
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in to get John's take on this. So, I mean, in some real sense, this was a trial that pit Jews against Jews, and as you know, John, on every side. So for people who don't know, Kevin Schultz is Jewish, the lead prosecutor. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, two of the Chicago Seven, are Jewish, and then Hoffman, the judge, is also Jewish. And there is so much going on here to the point where I believe, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but like at points during the trial, Abby Hoffman literally calls the judge a Nazi. He literally starts throwing Yiddish phrases at him at some point. I think he calls him a shanda for the Jews, and that he's basically a sellout to the Goyim. I think at one point he even calls him a capo, which was the name of the sort of the Jewish concentration guard leader who would run these bunkers. And so there's a lot going on here. So on one hand, there's like Jews representing different strands of modernity on all sides of the American government, but even more than that, to some degree, particularly in the Hoffman versus Hoffman discussion, it's really these old style American German Jews who came in the 19th century, and the Ostjuden, the Jews from Eastern Europe who came in the early 20th century. So there's this whole thing about this whole Jewish issue that's totally ignored in the movie. It's gestured toward a little bit with Hoffman and with Abby Hoffman yelling at Judge Hoffman. And there's also complicated questions about Sacha Baron Cohen and comments he's made about Israel and the IDF, even though he portrayed negatively an IDF soldier in one of his more recent things. But we could bracket that. So, John, I'm curious, what do you think of the Jewish issues going on in the trial? And then also, what do you think of like Sorkin's own relationship to his own Jewishness? He's a person of Jewish descent, but there's been criticisms of him in the past for sort of like overlooking or putting down Jewish elements in his work. And I think in this movie, it's represented in the fact that he makes Tom Hayden the hero, and he makes Jerry Rubin essentially an idiot, and Abby Hoffman sort of this charming buffoon. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that whole issue about Jews, radicalism, Sorkin, all those things I just brought up.
Well, you're absolutely right. And people did notice this at the time. Not only were the people who you listed as Jewish, but both of the defense attorneys, William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass, are Jewish. And there was another Jewish defendant, Lee Weiner. Mm-hmm. Lee Weiner was Jewish. So, yeah, Jews on both sides. You know, I'm more interested in like what you make of this, because this is your thing. I mean, Abby is the one who's sort of identified in the movie as Jewish, in that he does speak Yiddish. He as you say, he addresses the judge in Yiddish and uses these Jewish tropes. They don't make that much of Jerry being Jewish or the defense attorneys being Jewish.
Allen Ginsberg is another character in there as well.
Now that you mention it. So Abby go ahead.
Sorry, please. I was just going to say, I think it's just related to, I don't want to say self-hating because I don't think that's right, but I think Sorkin has a complicated relationship to his Jewishness where he wants to sort of paper over it in a sense, where he basically esteems, well, it's also interesting that he makes Tom Hayden basically someone of Irish descent into essentially a WASP. I mean, in his affect and casting an English guy, Eddie Redmayne, to play him and all these other issues. So I think there's like...
I forgot that was Eddie Redmayne.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. It's like it's really interesting. It's like the psychological. I mean, Sorkin just lets you paint with Freudian brushes so easily. But I think it's related to his, like, he self-denies his Judaism, which I think is represented by is embodied in his politics and his desire to become part of the essentially liberal WASP establishment. And it's also interesting, a person whose Jewishness he downplays is Schultz, who in real life, I did some research, also seemed to have downplayed his Jewishness as well, even though he was buried in a Jewish cemetery. I just checked yesterday. And so I think this is like
good research.
No, I did the research, but I think it's just like this very complicated strand that runs through Sorkin's entire thing, and it would have been made the movie so much richer to actually bring out what is, I think, one of the essential subterranean things happening in this trial, which is how do Jews who have found the promised land in America in the post-Holocaust world decide to deal with the problems of modernity? And there are people like Schultz who become establishment. There are people like Hoffman who are already part of the establishment who don't even want to think about their Jewishness, very similar to Walter Lippmann. And there are people like Hoffman who's like, actually, we see the secular modernity and we think it's actually pretty fucked up and we want to change it. And Sorkin just has nothing to say about that. I'm not even sure if he notices it because he has such a strange relationship to his own Judaism, which becomes through. And I don't know if you remember Studio 60 and the Sunset Strip, but, based on his own life, dating a woman who I believe was an evangelical Christian and sort of lionizing the politics and the worldview that come along with that. So I just thought it was just a very much a missed opportunity and could have made the movie a little bit more interesting and speak to sort of these larger questions.
We're gonna have to remake it, Danny. We're gonna have to make our own.
No, fund us,
Chicago.
David. That's the problem.
I mean, it is. I think John, you would agree. It's an Aaron Sorkin version of the trial of the Chicago 7, right?
Yes, I call it Sorkinized history. Follows the Sorkin rules, and I mean, I just had one other thing. Hollywood is, shall we say, notoriously Jewish studios, historically created and run by Jews. And this is something that now is, there's a rising tide, we are told, of worldwide anti-Semitism that argues that Jews control there's an international conspiracy to control world media. So I think Sorkin probably has that in the back of his mind, like, let's not make too much about this because our enemies are everywhere. So that's another factor. I'm just guessing that this is part of, the consciousness of Hollywood Jews today.
Wow. I wonder, thinking about this movie, I remember very clearly seeing the Chicago 10 animated film, which came out in I want to say 2007 or 8, somewhere in there. Danny, it's the same director that made Montage of Heck, the Nirvana film.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So he made the Chicago 10 animated film. And I was watching the Trial of Chicago 7, the Sorkin film, last night on Netflix, and it sort of contained a similar scene, which is that there's always the scene of Grant Park. There's always a scene. This is sorry, Danny. This is a totally different subject than the Jewishness of the film.
No, it's okay. We covered it.
But I think it fits in here. But this fight that happened at Grant Park between the police and the protesters, the demonstrators. It seems like it's depicted often. I feel like filmmakers don't know what to do with it. In other words, they don't know what to do with crowds and police. And there's a sort of in the animated film, it's like they use Eminem and this kind of pounding rap rock soundtrack, and you're supposed to sort of be energized. And it happens in the Sorkin film too. There's a sort of rock soundtrack. There's a sort of visceral excitement. I wonder, it's kind of it's an image of the 60s, and it's an image of our period now, which is crowds fighting cops. And I wonder, sort of how that's portrayed in this film. It feels like filmmakers don't know what to do with it. It almost feels like America doesn't know what to do with it. Is it exciting? Is it charged? Is it bad? Is it good? It seems like a really paralyzing moment for filmmakers, and yet we always wanted to pick that.
Sorkin worried about that. He said in some of his interviews that all of Sorkin's shows are indoor shows. He has never shot outside.
That's
there are
amazing.
usually people, having these speechifying events in rooms is kind of the Aaron Sorkin experience. And his idea, he was very proud that they shot in the real Grant Park. And the best he could come up with was to try to match exactly the newsreel footage. And he's very proud of the fact that in his movie, they intercut between the reenactment of the battle with the police in Grant Park and the newsreel footage, and the cuts match.
I noticed that.
He worked for weeks to get this right because I think you would correctly describe his attitude that he wasn't quite sure how to portray fighting the police in the park. It's certainly not anything he knows anything about.
You know what film does a great job of it? I don't know if you've seen Medium Cool.
That was shot in the real park at the real time.
They did a great job of depicting it because it's literally footage from the event.
Haskell Wexler. Yeah, there's the famous line in that movie, Haskell, this is real.
Right. And he actually, for those who haven't seen Medium Cool, I have a poster of it on my wall somewhere. Haskell Wexler shot the film with was it Bob Forster? It's Robert Forster, right? The actors are walking through Grant Park, are walking through the violence of and they're shooting a fiction. They're shooting a fiction film, fictional characters with a script as they're running through the riots of the Chicago Convention. I don't know how he timed that, but it's a really great depiction of this stuff. It's a reminder to me that event, whatever happened in Chicago in '68, resonates with that generation. But I think the stuff that Danny brought up throughout this conversation is kind of like the bigger question, and it's still stuck with me, which is like, what does it matter? How is it connected today? Are kids today going to watch Trial of the Chicago 7 and be inspired by it? I mean, those are big questions that I don't think we can generally answer.
I have a question. Yeah. I have a question for Jon, actually. So, as someone who studied these people, why do you think most of them just bought into the establishment in the 70s, became new age people, became hyper individualist people, thought that transformation, basically embraced neoliberalism, like not to, fight about that, but like that is a meaningful legacy of that. A lot of these radicals totally went in this establishment neoliberal direction to the me decade. Why do you think that was? And what do you think that says about the radicalism of this particular moment? Well, this moment being the 60s. Sorry.
Okay. First, let's just be specific about who we're talking about here. Jerry Rubin, the one who.
And Rennie Davis.
Yeah.
Well, Rennie Davis also went into
this
new
age direction what Rennie is back in action now. He's always had this interest in kind of utopian communities and. Right now, he is trying to. He says that the Trump election is not a big deal. The big deal is the climate crisis. I mean, he's right with us on this, and that I did an event with him, so I know I have 2 events with him, so I know exactly what
that's
what
amazing. I thought Rennie Davis was a lost figure when I was Rennie Davis was I did my research on GI coffee houses, and Rennie Davis and Tom Hayden were the figures that came from SDS, came from the MOB to meet with Fred Gardner and build the Summer of Support, which became the coffee houses. And Rennie's a big character in there, and I never could track him down. I never could find any pictures of the guy. I mean, he's like Thomas Pinchon.
Well, but he's reemerged partly because of this, but his story is that he had a personal crisis like lots of other people when the 60s came to an end, and he says that he lived in the bottom of the Grand Canyon for 4 years and emerged with a kind of new age consciousness that the future lies within, and that, don't let the bastards get you down. And what he's trying to do now is organize to organize what he calls a new nation of intentional communities that will be self-sufficient.
Burning Man, yeah.
And that's Silicon Valley. Nonsense. Sorry to interrupt.
It's not Silicon Valley in that they're not selling anything. I mean, his attitude is, I'm not here to convince you should do this, but if you want to join us, you're welcome.
That's apolitical. But
hold on, Danny. There's a great piece in Jon's book where Rennie returns from India and is talking about all this stuff, because he basically his first step in this was going to India and talking to someone who was like not the Maharishi, but someone
a different one, the boy guru.
And there's a quote from Tom Hayden that says, when Rennie came back and told me all this stuff, I felt ill.
Speaking of our friend Tom Hayden, who becomes allied with Governor Jerry Brown.
That's right.
Tom Hayden becomes a left-wing Democrat in California.
State assemblyman, right?
A state assemblyman for many years. He did good things as a legislator. He represented my district. I supported him. I did door-to-door work for Tom Hayden. So I'm sort of part of I wrote this book with him. So he made the decision. Actually, Sorkin kind of anticipates what Tom Hayden became, which is somebody who did believe elections were everything.
Right. When you look at it through the individuals, I think it's very easy to kind of see legacies in different ways too, because these particular 7 went in different directions. People make a lot about Bobby Seale being a barbecue guy in the 90s, but to me, like, the larger thing is like, what about all those people that were at Grant Park? They were also part of that movement, and I wonder what happened to all of them. Because,
if you look at what there were. The biggest radical student organization of the 60s was SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. In 1969, at the National SDS Convention in Chicago, the group split into the Maoists and the New Leftists, and they each kicked each other out. And SDS collapsed just at the moment when more millions of people than ever before had decided the war was wrong and the war was unjust. If you look at what happened to Black radicalism, there was this internecine war, really, but that we write about in LA in the 60s between the Black Panthers and Ron Karenga's US organization that ended up with 2 US members killing 2 Black Panthers at UCLA. So, the 60s radicalism was sort of internecine rivalries and battles and warfare kind of destroyed the organizations in a way that was extremely demoralizing to ground troops like me. Nevertheless, eventually the anti-war movement prevailed and the United States withdrew all its troops from Vietnam, and Vietnam was reunited.
But switched to a bombing campaign. I mean, the big success is that then it destroys Cambodia, Laos, and more of Vietnam. I mean, that's what happens in 69, 70.
That's not the anti-war movement that does that, though.
Well, I think it's partially. I think the success of the anti-war movement is, quote unquote, is linked to the fact that it forced Nixon to switch to bombing, and then the war lasts for years longer. I mean, you can't. I do appreciate the anti-war movement, but that's a big deal too. A lot of Vietnamese still died after 69.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And that's one reason why people got depressed and, argued that what we've done is no good and America is hopeless. And, let's not have a movement.
It leads to, I mean, they're kind of broad strokes, but it leads to, this sort of 70s diffusion, and then, the Reagan culmination of a lot of people sort of seeking, wealth in Wall Street and the suburban life and that sort of thing. I mean, I feel like this stuff has played out in a lot of different ways in the years after the 1960s. I mean, one thing that I think that sort of bothers me about this movie more than anything is placing it in 68. And sort of the ending of the 60s in 68, because as you know, I mean, John, your book with Mike Davis is so much stuff after 68, so much stuff in high schools and so much stuff happening on the left that I think when we look at it through the eyes of Jerry Rubin, who went and became a stockbroker, it can be really easy to draw huge conclusions. But at the same time, the larger story is that the radicalism waned and liberalism prevailed, and a sort of neoliberal capitalism rose, and that I think is requiring young people who are looking at the 1960s to sort of figure out, well, what's changed in the years since? How can we approach a left that builds on what the 60s did and avoids the mistakes? And I think that's something that, if for better or worse, I'll be optimistic. I'll say Trial of the Chicago 7 is a conversation starter. We just had a nice conversation about it. And it's something that I think, drops people into an era that they don't know anything about. Sorkin is lucky because this film goes along with the politics today. I thought there would be a little more kind of allusions to the Trump era in the film. I was pleasantly surprised that there wasn't too much of that stuff. But yeah, Sorkin's someone that, Danny, I think you and I don't know if we'll get jobs on the next Sorkin piece.
If he pays me, I'm willing to say everything I just said was wrong and foolish. I'll sell out in a second, like my boy Jerry Rubin.
Yeah,
give me a chance. Give me a chance to sell out.
Sorry, Aaron. That's what I always say, that millennials can't sell out because no one's buying. But David, let me just add just one very quick thing.
Sure,
I think my big criticism of the 60s, and particularly this movement, is that in retrospect, and perhaps you couldn't know this at the time, and I'm talking specifically about the realm of foreign foreign policy, is that the activists connected to the anti-war movement were not sufficiently sophisticated about how power actually works, particularly in terms of foreign policy making in American society. So while the right wing was spent decades building up institutions, building up networks, building up people who could literally staff the state, the left really didn't do that. And the left really retreated, so that you have a foreign policy conversation that's basically, between A and B. You either bomb with drones or you invade. There's no real conversation there. And I think that's connected partially to the fact that the left didn't understand or didn't appreciate or didn't really look into how foreign policy making power actually works. And we're just getting over it now with the creation of institutes like the Quincy Institute, who actually, which I'm a part of, but I think is like a step in the right direction, even if it's not explicitly left, that really appreciates how you actually go about making significant strategic foreign policy changes in this community and in this world. And so I just wanted to add that quick.
Makes me think of Daniel Ellsberg. There's so many Dannys and Daniels lately, but it makes me think of Daniel Ellsberg, because if there was one person on the left that was sort of thinking about, how American foreign policy works from the inside, I feel like he brought that, and that's something that didn't really come until the later part of the war, right? I mean, I feel like we're post 68 once Ellsberg drops that stuff, because that's when the Church Committee happened. I mean, that's when there was like sort of a wider knowledge of the COINTELPRO, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's a really important point. I think that foreign policy is something that the left had to sort of learn during the 1960s because of Vietnam, if that makes sense. I don't know. But Jon, thank you so much for joining us. We really had a fun conversation. It's good talking.
Thank you so much, Jon. Really appreciate it.
It was great, and I still hope you guys do get a chance to sell out, because it
seems awesome. I really
Here's
hope
hoping.
I can.
Yeah. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you.
All right, that was a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I want to thank Danny Bessner and Jon Wiener for being willing to be open about American history and the legacy of the 60s and what we're even doing here when we think about that era and what it means to us as people who remember the era and as young people who don't. How do we package that legacy for them? I think these are big, important questions. I don't think Aaron Sorkin is answering them to my satisfaction or the satisfaction of anyone in this audience. But maybe you like Aaron Sorkin. What do you think? Hit me up on the Patreon. We are doing a lot with pop culture over there. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I am live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. That is other times in other time zones. But either way, if you can't catch me live, I put up that live stream every week. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks to all the people who are supporting the show. It makes everything possible. And I hope you're doing well. We'll talk to you very soon. All right. See ya.